We met a couple of years back, and we decided that together we could make a difference in the Barents Sea. So we started out actually by the beginning of ExploCrowd in the Barents Sea. Yeah, in the Barents Sea, and we did publish a paper together. And now we've come even further. Can you maybe tell a little bit about what we achieved? And
in the Barents Sea specifically, the key thing, of course, is there is salt, but it's very poorly understood in the area, and because everything's deeper. And although a lot of people know that the salt's there, and they've been interpreting in the Norwegian continental margin forever, there are subtleties that people aren't really aware of usually. And when you get your eye into it, you can actually really start to refine your interpretations. And one of the key things we did there is by recognizing the level of salt, because it was really, everybody thought it was off the bottom of the data. And for example, the Tromsø Basin or farther west. And by looking for those subtle geometries, we were able to actually pin down the level of the salt, which then constrained the level of the source rock. And it was different than people had mapped before, so that had a profound influence. Then you had Torbjørn doing the petroleum systems modeling, and it really changed how we look at things.
Absolutely. And the petroleum system modeling showed that we would have the possibility of oil where there had only been the possibility of gas before. So that was a deal breaker.
Yep. Really. And now we just need people to test that idea, don't we?
Yes. We're looking forward to some wells there, definitely.
Yeah.
But also just a lot of Norway is actually covered in salt. We were talking about maybe 60, 70, maybe up to 80%, because the entire North Sea, except for the north part, and also on the Halden Terrace.
Yeah, and then, if you look at a map, Martin Jackson put together a map of the salt basins in the world. And you have 3 large areas in the Norwegian continental shelf. Again, up in the Barents Sea, and then mid-Norway with the Haltenbanken, and then down in the central North Sea and coming into the South Viking Graben. And it's amazing if you compare the geometries between the North Viking Graben and the southernmost Viking Graben. Even though there's just a little bit of salt there, because you're near the northern limit of the salt, the geometries are astoundingly different. It's remarkable how much of a difference it makes. And it's the same tectonic history, it's the same rocks other than the salt, and yet the geometries are just incredibly different.
So why is it important? What's the impact?
Yeah, it impacts everything from obviously the salt in general. Just even ignoring just the Norwegian continental shelf, the salt in general impacts every aspect of the petroleum system. Obviously, it impacts trap formation, because a lot of the traps are related to that salt deformation. Although that salt deformation may be just a consequence of, say, the extensional history, still that difference that it makes plays a huge role. And it impacts, of course, if you're looking at sands, whether they're things like the Upper Jurassic, like the Ula sand, or whether they are up in the Paleocene. These salt bodies are growing and affecting the seafloor topography. And so whether it's because the salt body is collapsing, and so you get these troughs like the interpods in the central North Sea, or whether the diapirs are growing, and so you're impacting, say, sediment transport in the Triassic of the Nordkapp Basin, it's incredibly important. And then the third one, of course, is it affects hydrocarbon maturation. If your source rocks are sitting on top of salt for a prolonged period of time, that has an impact on the timing of maturation. If they're next to a diapier, it depends on whether they're near the upper part or the lower part of the diapier. It has a different effect. It can affect migration of hydrocarbons. Not as important in the Norwegian continental shelf as, say, in the Gulf of Mexico, where there are all these salt sheets. And then finally, it can impact pore pressure. That's something not understood quite as well. But yeah, it has an impact on every aspect of the petroleum system. So I'm a little biased, but to me it's the framework for everything. Yeah. And so without a solid understanding of that, you're missing an important part of the picture.
And that's where we really wanted to set in, and why we ask you for help in order to get that full understanding of the deep structural controls of everything. Because, for instance, on the South Viking Graben between the Utsira High and the South Viking Graben, then there's very poor seismic resolution, and you get these potential detaching faults on salt, and there are some seismic effects that overprints the actual geometries.
Absolutely.
There. So understanding the impact and how the fault geometries are really...
And I had an interesting experience yesterday, which I think relates directly to this, because I was looking at data with someone from some part of the Norwegian continental shelf. We'll just keep that quiet. And they have some really, I've seen data there before, but it was challenging, and you thought you saw some things, but you're not sure. They have some proprietary reprocessed data, and it's superb. And you can really see the geometries. Now there's a tendency to say, okay, we can see it, that's enough. We don't need to actually understand anything. I'm not saying they thought that, but there can be that tendency. But what we're doing with the really good data is we're able to start to address why we're getting these anomalous geometries. And you could see the salt much better, and you could see its relationship to the overlying faults. And there are some very enigmatic relationships that were quite a puzzle to me, actually. But you start to develop an understanding. Then you can take that, where you have really good data, and you can go along strike where there's still plenty of potential. And in that same system, when the data aren't as good, and you at least now have an idea of the kinds of geometries and processes that help you put together an interpretation that's not as bad. I won't say it's perfect, but it's not as bad as what you might have otherwise.
Yeah, and that most likely has an impact on migration history and the distribution of pressure cells.
And not just that. They're chasing a certain reservoir level. And there are some faults that when you just, it's very easy to miscorrelate because of sort of the repetitive pattern of the reflectors. Or you see something that just makes zero sense. Well, it can't be down here because I'm missing a lot of section. But understanding what happens with, say, an extensional diap here, there is a way of doing that, and it's the only explanation that works. And that gives you more confidence in your cross-fault correlations, which gives you more traps. Or at least, again, lower risk. You think that it's actually here, but people argue with you that can't be because there's not enough section between that and the salt. When you can draw them a picture of how that works, oh, okay, well, let's pursue that because that could have 40 million barrels or something like that.
Sounds like a very good reason to go into this to me. So how in your work, how are people using your expertise elsewhere on the planet?
It's varied. How do I put this? Because I do a mix of consulting and teaching and research, you really can't separate any of it. But my consulting work is ultimately about teaching. I tend to be very upstream, even more than the average explorationist, because one of my main roles is to just teach them about the styles and the processes, what can happen, what doesn't happen, and therefore how to look at the data and come up with some better interpretations. But of course, I also do get involved in actually evaluating prospects, so it spans the whole range. A lot of my work in recent years has been in the southern Gulf of Mexico because that whole basin opened up its frontier with world-class source rock. But I'd have to say, actually, number two, kind of thinking about it right now, actually number two is the Norwegian continental shelf. I'm going into a company next week also, and so I'm spending 5 more days here in Stavanger. So I've already been to Stavanger once this year, and I was up in Harstad once this year, and so I get to Norway fairly often. So.
And it's a pleasure every time you stop by.
And we take Norwegians down to look at the rocks in the field.
That is right, because something new has happened, groundbreaking. Well,
I'm not sure what you're referring to on that one.
We have a web shop.
Yes,
and
that
we
one.
Have
yes,
launched,
so we actually ran a trip for a company and their partners here. And they were focused on one field in the central North Sea. And we ran a trip, and it was an interesting trip. We customized it for the purpose of this. And we went to the Basque Pyrenees, and what we did is we chased one sandstone from diapier to diapier effectively. But it's a sandstone that ranges in that relatively small area from fluvial, intertidal, to shore face sands, to deep water turbidites. And it's the same age unit, and we see it in very different relationships. So we see different stratigraphy, and that's fine, but the focus here is on the salt-sediment interaction and relation and faulting. And so we see it with very different relationships at different diapiers. You might think, well, okay, it's a sand next to a diapier. No, we have, there are things that are equivalent in a way to some of the central North Sea diapiers where you're getting the sand on top of an unconformity, like the base Jurassic unconformity that's down the southern central North Sea. And you get, for example, the Ula sand. And we have something very analogous to that. It's a different history and details. And then it all got faulted, which is exactly what happened in the south. Anyway, so what we've done is you and I decided to offer this trip through ExploCrowd. And so you put it on the website, 2 months ago, I think, or so?
Just one.
Just 1 month ago.
Yeah.
And so one thing that we did was you'd said something about, offering it to companies, if you have 10 people, if you have this. But one thing that we just were talking about yesterday was actually just saying, okay, we're going to offer the trip, and you can have an individual for this company sign up, and 3 from that company, and these academics, and whatever, and go down there, and it's a 4-day trip, and people really liked what they saw. They saw the direct applicability to the Norwegian continental shelf. So we have to schedule that, don't we?
We definitely have to do that. But also, in terms of the central graben, when you're looking at that, then it's the easy traps that have been tested in the central graben.
That's right.
There's so much more, I think, to go down and test.
But that's even true in the Haltenbanken. I mean, there also, there's all sorts of near-field opportunities, all the different little fault blocks. And the better images, of course, help enormously. I mean, you can't do it without the best images that you can get.
And understanding.
But the understanding is the other part.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, no, it's funny because people think, well, how would the Pyrenees be an analog? But what you have to remember is the Pyrenees, yes, they have shortening, but it's late shortening. And yes, there's a lot of it, but actually quite a few of the diapiers have hardly been deformed by the shortening. They've just been translated. Yeah. And so what you're really looking at is the early histories and the early history is one of rifting. And so again, from shallow water to deeper water settings, and so very analogous to large parts of, the entire Norwegian continental shelf. I just read a paper a couple days ago that is about the influence of a carrier bed. So so if you think about impermeable muds, and you have a carrier bed. They're just a simple numerical model with just one. When normally we have more sands, of course, and the influence on pressure from the center of the basin to close to the diapier, and it was actually quite interesting. They also suggested it might influence how the diapiers grow. I found that less convincing because it used some simple assumptions that I think we've disproved years ago. But I think the pressure work was quite interesting. So yeah, there's still lots to be done there.
Absolutely. And there are still many mature areas in Norway where we still lack that insight, I believe. Also because of well data. We need more wells. In order to understand these areas better.
We do, and I'd really like to see more wells in the Western Barents Sea. It's interesting. I mean, I also got to, as you know, I got to do a project on the conjugate margin, the Northeast Greenland, and huge structures, huge potential. I seriously doubt that it'll ever be tested. Just given the current climate, who knows, if the oil price goes up to 100 again and stays there for 5 years, we might see something. because a lot of a number of the big companies were in there. But these are still frontier basins, including the Western Barents. And we know there's a working petroleum system. It may be more oil-rich in places than people think, and it just needs more testing.
It really does. Unfortunately, there are some licenses that have been awarded, and hopefully wells that will be drilled.
I've seen examples over and over again of people sort of trying to over-science things in a way. So here I am, it's kind of ironic. I'm saying how we need to understand salt, et cetera, and yet I'm now saying that we can over-science things. And you can convince yourself that there's no chance of something. And again, it's a game of risk, and we don't always get those risk numbers right. Ultimately, there's only one way to tell. I realize it's a more expensive way, but the only way is to actually test, to drill those wells. And that's what is sometimes missing in today's climate.
Because it's a high risk to take that decision, to take a drill decision and spend the money doing it. Yeah,
but the most successful companies are the ones that do. And they know that, we all know this, they know that a bunch of them aren't going to work. We just need one or two that work nicely, and it pays off. But that kind of gets lost in all the various levels of management decision. I mean, I come from an outside perspective, but I've worked with companies actually in final meetings where risk is being assigned to prospects and numbers are being assigned to bid on blocks, for example, northern Gulf of Mexico, and so I've seen that, and you can see there are companies that really they go, right, no, I feel good about this. I want to see it tested. We're going to make the risk actually, the chance of success higher than the numbers you guys have come up with. And that's great, because then the numbers work out and you'll never know until you test it. And you see other companies where, oh no, if it's it's very rigorous, and if it's below a certain number, we're just going to write it off. And but you have to remember where those numbers come from. They're educated guesses, but they're still best guesses.
They are. I was also in a situation the other day where I was asked about a prospect. So if you have a well here that's showing poor porosity, and then on the other side of the fault block you have another well, how would you then expect that you can have good reservoir properties there?
Right.
Where my argument is, well, you have confidence here, you have confidence there, you have no idea about pressure, migration history, potential early introduction or migration of hydrocarbons that can actually preserve porosity. So you have no knowledge about that area. So if you drill, in the Western Barents Sea, it was 16 wells through 4 decades, all drilled on structural highs.
Yeah.
You know nothing. It's an area that's 400 by 250 square kilometers with a very high complexity, and we know the impact of the salt on the geometries there.
Well, Sissel, I can't help but always remember what you told me shortly after we first met, which was that you wanted to really help save the Norwegian petroleum industry. So we're counting on you.
We are. But I got you on my side, so we have a good chance.
For a few more years.
Yeah, for a few more years.
My wife keeps saying, when are you going to retire? I was like, what's that word?
I don't think you can ever retire because it's about passion.
Not entirely, it is.
It's about the passion for science. And I don't think that it's possible to just put that down.
And I coming back to that conference in London recently, at the end of someone said, so there's uncertainty about the future of funding for salt research, and all of this, but so why do we keep doing it? And everyone just agreed. And someone, it was actually me. I yelled out that because it's fun, and everybody goes, yes, it's fun, it's great, it's the best thing, and this whole room, and well, there it is. There's that passion.
That is this passion. That's a passion for science. And it has the potential to impact.
Absolutely.
It really does.
Yeah. You could just go around poking holes randomly, but no, nobody does that.